There we go.
Welcome, welcome, and good morning. My name is Nadia Abuzera. I'm an Associate Professor of International Development and Global Studies at the University of Ottawa, and I would like to welcome you to the inaugural webinar for the Al-Qazzaz Foundation for Education and Development. This is the first webinar of a series, so we invite you to join with us today, as well as every future webinar that we have coming up. The foundation, the Al-Qazzaz Foundation for Education and Development, was founded in Canada. I am currently based in Ottawa, and the foundation is based in Toronto in Canada. And the goal is to build relationships and to foster coordination with organizations and individuals around the world who share values of human rights, pluralism, and inclusion. Today's webinar will be given by Professor Emily Reagan-Wills. Professor Wills is an assistant professor in political studies at the University of Ottawa. She began her academic career as a student at Yale University in political science and women's and gender studies. She continued her master's and her PhD at the New School in New York, the New School for Social Research, and she currently works at the University of Ottawa. She is co-coordinator of an international project to develop education, online education, in community mobilization in crisis, quite a timely subject. And she will be presenting to us today on the subject of education in community mobilization. Without further ado, here's Professor Emily Reagan-Wills.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nadia, and it's wonderful to be here. And I'm quite happy to be able to be a part of this series and honored to be the first in the series. So what I've got in terms of a presentation is I have sort of three movements I'm going to go through in the course of talking about why education is so central for community development and community building in a broad variety of contexts. Because this is one of the things that everybody seems to agree on, right? Is that if we're talking about how to build communities, how to make stronger communities, and how to create social change, that education is a central part of that. But we often haven't stopped to think about why. We have some kind of intuitive notion that it's important that people know things, that people learn things, that they do well in educational systems. Maybe we haven't thought it through, maybe we haven't expressed it. And so knowing that this is something that so many different types of actors say, oh, we need to work on education in our, whether it's local community development practice, in organizing our local communities, or in international development. But I want to take a step back and say, what's it doing, right? Why is education something that we all seem to think is so important? And what do we get out of it? And how does its dynamics work? This is the sort of researcher I am, in that I'm always asking, wait, but why does this work? Why does this do the work we're asking it to do and accomplish it? So that's the approach I'm taking here today. And I'm going to talk in kind of three separate segments. The first two segments are based on my previous research with Arab community organizations in New York City, which is the foundation for my forthcoming book. And I'm going to talk about the work that education did in immigrant reception spaces in the United States, which for those of us who are Canadian, it's very different context in the American political system and social system than the Canadian, but some of the grounds are the same, so you can hear that. And then after I talk about that, I'm going to move into talking about the Community Mobilization in Crisis Project, which I think is another example of saying education is the right tool for meeting some of our social change goals and why it works so well for that. So let me quickly bring up my presentation so that you guys can see some images I have for you guys here. So let me start by saying, I want to start by telling the story about how I got into studying education, because I didn't intend to. It wasn't my first goal when I was a young graduate student starting my research. When I set out to talk about what are the kind of important political themes in Arab community life in New York City, which is what I was looking for as a dissertation writing student, I said, you know what I think would be really interesting is if we talked about democracy, right? If I went and saw what people are talking about in terms of democracy. And the reason I thought this was interesting is we just had a presidential election in the US, and because I was starting in late 2008, early 2009. And there's this whole academic conversation about why Arabs don't accept democracy, right? And I knew that entire conversation was ridiculous, right? Because that it just didn't fit. It didn't make any sense. It didn't correspond to what I knew about the Middle East or what I knew about Arabs and diaspora. And so it was this whole like really racist conversation. And I said, I want to disrupt this. I want to look at how people are actually talking and thinking about democracy. And what I found is when I went into Arab community spaces looking for conversations about democracy, nobody was talking about democracy, elections, kind of these basic processes. Some of this was timing. There'd just been an election. So there'd been a lot of get out the vote work among people who were citizens. And some of this, so it was timing in that way. And it was also timing in the sense that the next time a big set of conversations about democracy happened in Arab New York was during the time of the revolutions in 2010, 2011. And that's, if you look at the PowerPoint, the picture on the left is from a pro-democracy protest among Egyptian Americans in New York City. And that one was run in a local paper. But since I was in 2009, so nobody was talking about elections or voting or democracy or anything like that. And so, like many a young researcher, I was like, oh no, what do I do instead? And I realized that what I was finding instead was educational programs. So the photo on the right is a photograph of the youth summer program that I volunteered with. That was one of my 2 field sites for doing research on education at the Arab American Association, which is a social services organization located in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, which is the largest Arab community in New York. And what I found was that educational programs were the backbone, not just of this one organization, but of a whole set of organizations that we're working in different contexts with Arab communities all over the city. That almost every Arab community organization had an educational program or an educational framework to it. And I wanted to know why, right? This was the question I had, is why was education so, oh, we can't see slides? I just got a message about that. There you go. Can you see it now? Sorry, give me 1 minute. Apologize for this. Can you see the slides now? Okay, never mind. I'm going to quit with the screen sharing, and I'm just going to, you guys will just be spared my photographs, and you'll just have to see my face instead. I apologize for that. Oh, wait, we got them back. Hold on, let me try that one more time. Okay. Okay. Apologies for the technical area difficulties. Okay, so anyway, so I got to this this place where I was saying, okay, something's going on with education. Why is it so central to what everybody is doing? And the question that I came up with is that education is this sort of thing that we all tend to agree on, and that it becomes a kind of central consensual reason why people work on, why people do community work. There's 2 reasons why education is so important for community groups. The first one is that that education serves a number of depoliticizing functions. And so if groups are worried about being seen as too political, being seen as outsiders, being seen as threatening, or being seen as too likely to try to change what's happening, then they will often point to educational work as a way of understanding what they're doing as not political, not dangerous, but a part of bringing people into the community. And so what I've got up in my slides right now is a quote from Hannah Arendt, which I don't agree with in the least, but I think it frames this idea that there's this distinction between politics and education. and that education is non-political. And the sort of political science research I do says that education is a political process because we argue about it. Says that it's a political process because there's contestation over power relationships that happens through the process. And also that it forms us, and that it makes us, in the way Arendt is saying here, that it makes us ready to participate in politics. But we're already ready to participate in politics when we enter the educational sphere. So on the one hand, people have this belief that education serves to make us neutral. And this is in fact enshrined in the US tax code, which is that if you want to be a charitable organization that can give people tax benefits for donating to you, then what you have to do is serve in as an educational function. Right? That's one of the ways you can do it. The other thing is that education is non-controversial fundamentally, in that we believe that both people in communities agree that they need education, and so do the powerful people who determine the funding of organizations, determine the ways that they're able to continue to function, right? Everybody agrees that particularly immigrant groups need education, and particularly children of immigrants need education. And so education becomes an important way for us to talk and think about, for community groups to do the work they want to do, to get funding, to kind of make changes and engage with communities in a way that provide them with resources, in ways that look non-threatening, in ways that are kind of agreeable, and that follow common consensus about what's good in our communal life together. So I'm about to transition to the next part of the talk. If folks who are watching on the live stream, if you have questions, there'll be a Q&A at the end, and so feel free to drop in your questions on the YouTube, and Nadia and Bayan will be able to transfer them over as we continue on. So anyway, so I've talked about the fact that education is important for community organizations because it allows them to receive resources, and it allows them to go in and kind of make a set of assumptions about it allows them to kind of directly serve their communities in a bigger and more direct way. But then the question is, what's happening in these educational spaces? And the answer is yes, education. People are learning things. So the two sites I worked on were a women's ESL class, which you can see a photo of it here on the slide. That was my co-teacher who's standing up at the front of the classroom there. And then the other program I worked on was a children's summer camp. And both of those were spaces where people were able to make real learning gains in terms of improving their spoken English for the women in the ESL class, or in terms of having somewhere kind of safe and supportive to be during the summer for the kids. And so both of these were great programs that accomplished that goal. But I want to talk about the other goal that they accomplished. And the note I have up there is educational programs as sites of community building, political socialization, and identity making. And I think these are really important things that educational programs can do. Because what happens in the space of an educational program is that people talk to each other. In fact, people are supposed to express things about themselves. They are supposed to put forth new ideas and test them with others. Educational spaces are spaces of ongoing discourse and dialogue. And so they become places where people can talk and express and present themselves. And this is particularly important for immigrant communities because they are being put together out of a set of individuals who didn't previously have relationships with each other and who are coming to a new place and are trying to make new identities. In order for any of us to be social actors and political actors, we need to have relevant, useful, contextual identities that we can use to operate socially. We need to understand how we relate to others, who is like us and who is unlike us, because it's through those sorts of exchanges that allow us to be members of a community. And when you're a new immigrant somewhere, you don't necessarily have those to start out, right? And the rules you had of who you were and how you related to others that made sense in your place of origin may not make sense in your new place. And so what you need to do is figure out who you are now, who you are in this place. And you need to be able to develop those relationships. And that's the work that happened in these community educational programs, because this ongoing dialogue was happening. So I found that the women who I taught were very eager to talk about how America was different from back home, how culture and practices were different. But what I found is that they spent a lot of that time forming relationships among each other and understanding themselves as a single group. And I'm going to give you a change to look at my face for a minute. And so what they found is, instead of relating to themselves as all different, these were women from all over the Arab world. There were Palestinians, Jordanians, Egyptians, Yemeni. They came from different class backgrounds. They came from different educational backgrounds. They didn't have a lot in common at that kind of basic level, right? And they wouldn't necessarily have said that they belonged to the same sorts of groups if you'd asked them before immigration. But once they were all together living in Brooklyn, they had to work together to form an identity that could include all of them, to form a collective Arab American identity. That was something that could give them strength and comfort in their new place. And the class gave that an opportunity to happen. And that's where people came together and formed a common identity in a way that they could use going forward, which was really useful. And they did it through all sorts of things, through talking about back home, right? None of them said what countries they were from when they were talking about back home. It was all just back home, right? Which kind of emphasized the space. Through distinguishing between my religion or the American culture and their culture, right? So making that kind of binary distinction that helped them understand differences. And also through kind of just generally sharing of cultural practices. There was this wonderful moment where the Yemeni women brought in a Yemeni meal for us to share during class. And the other women in the class, kind of all of it was unfamiliar to them, because ghasid is not a food that's eaten much outside of Yemen. But for them, it was all like, oh, we understand this practice, and it became a place of cultural sharing. And similarly for the kids, they found that they were able to be both Arab and American in kind of whole and meaningful ways during their time in the program. And so in these spaces, and in particularly in these more informal educational spaces that didn't have strict curriculum and the sets of things to get through, but that were designated as spaces where you were meant to be learning and testing and exploring and thinking, people found that they were places where there could be a clear way for them to start articulating a new identity. And that those new identities were the foundations that were then able to lead them into greater integration in community life and greater integration into the political life of their new home. And so educational spaces, even these most informal ones, even the ones where you're really not sure what's happening curriculum-wise, right? By making these spaces, making them open, making them spaces of dialogue, you can do a real service to a community in letting it form itself and move forward. So moving on to my next point, I want to talk a little bit about the work I'm doing right now in Lebanon. The need to work and talk and think about responses to the Syrian crisis, and in particularly the massive refugee movements that are almost unparalleled, and that are something that we haven't dealt with as an international community. There's a need to do something, right? And so I think we all feel that need to do something. And I got involved in this project, and kind of one of the questions that has always mattered for me is, why is education the right way to do this? And in some ways, I think I'm particularly interested in education-based interventions into the Syrian crisis because I'm an educator, right? Because I'm a university teacher, and I think education matters, and I think it transforms people's lives and potentials, right? But at the same time, I think choosing to do an educational intervention matters in response to the Syrian crisis, because we can see that there are particular utilities that educational approaches can give in order to be able to really make a change and try to support positive social change to come out of such a horrendous crisis. So I'm going to bring back up my slides. The particular project I'm working on is focused in Lebanon. And Lebanon, along with Turkey, has really borne the brunt of the neighboring countries of Syria in terms of refugee arrivals, to say nothing of the destruction that's happened inside Syria. And the situation in Lebanon today is that 1 in 3 people in Lebanon is either a Syrian or a Palestinian refugee. That's been approximately 1.5 million new arrivals in a country of 4 million prior. So basically a huge, huge increase in people arriving. And it's absolutely changed the social landscape. Whereas there had always been migration and circulation between these two countries, in the context of the current crisis, it's escalated to a huge extent. And I have to say, all parties are not prepared to manage it. There are big issues of infrastructure and of kind of social capacity and economic stability that are making this fundamentally welcoming act of letting in so many people who are fleeing violence and in search of a safe place to be, but it's caused massive trickle-down effects to the entirety of Lebanese society. And it's particularly an issue because refugees are barred from most legal employment. They face a high cost of living, and they face high barriers to all sorts of education. And so given the map that I've got up there, I actually don't think it's a terribly communicative map, because what it shows is that the entire country is red being the most dense refugees. I think it kind of shows the fact that people are out of ideas about how to color, about how to make a map about this. So the question for us is about, why is higher education the right answer? And some of this is about the fact that that Syrian refugee populations are already fairly well educated, and so higher education is what's available. But it's also because higher education leads people to be able to really make some significant changes in their lives. It helps people move forward and credential themselves for career purposes. And so that's one side of the equation, right, is why we should engage in higher education. But then the other side of the equation is, why are we teaching about community mobilization? And the reason for that is that there's strong civil society in Lebanon, and whereas the Syrian civil society was more suppressed, at the same time, there was the voluntary sector that people were engaged in. So there was a lot of people who want to do this sort of community work. And as along with social traditions of mutual care and charity. And so what it struck us is that people wanted to be able to help their communities. People wanted to be able to start projects in this new context and really break down and do something new. But at the same time, they didn't have the tools for it. They didn't have material resources, and they didn't have conceptual resources for working in this new space. And so what we settled on in developing this program is one that would do two things. One is it would meet the need for education by helping people earn transferable credits so they could work on a university education, which we know is really important to personal outcomes. And that also we'd create organizers who would be able to go out and work in communities and make changes. And that's really what we wanted to do. And so we think that this project is going to make changes in a couple of areas. We think it will help deal with some of the problems having to do with access to legal work for refugees. We think having a mixed student population of Syrians, Palestinians, Lebanese, and others will help build community contacts among different communities and help people work together. We think that we can, in a small project like this, be kind of flexible about people missing papers, which is a major issue. And we also think that we can address some of the other access issues through particular interventions. This project is still under development. We haven't launched it yet, and a big undertaking, but I think at the same time, we need to think largely and creatively if we're working on refugee issues about what education can do and why it is able to make changes. And so what I think the CMIC project does that is so important is that it is able to take these ideas about why education can make a difference and why education in this area can make a difference and can put them into practice. And that's what I'm really excited and looking forward to in this. So I want to thank you all for listening. I know I've slightly overrun my time, for which I apologize. But I'm looking forward to hearing your questions. And I've also sent some documents to the QED staff that they'll be sharing on their website. So if you want to learn any more about my research, please feel free to contact me outside of this. And you can read the other things I've written. Okay, thank you. And I'll turn it back over to Nadia for the Q&A.
Thank you, Emily, for that excellent presentation. I wanted to make the link between the project that you described in Lebanon and transnationally, right? It's a project that's beyond Lebanon. It's based in Canada, it runs internationally, and the foundation. So I would add that the foundation, the Al-Qazzaz Foundation for Education and Development, is a partner in that project and a contributor, and may launch that material online and may be instrumental in being able to promote it and to disseminate it very widely internationally. Are there any questions? This is going out to all of those listening at the moment. Are there any questions? I'll start with a question, but I'm waiting for questions. So as soon as I see one come up in the chat, I'll pose it to you, Emily. Emily, I have a question about education. It's very interesting to hear a university professor say, well, you know, the education can take the back burner. It's about building the community. And I imagine that's a hard lesson to learn for, you know, being an educator. What brought that lesson home for you, and how do you see community building? Maybe you can give me an example of someone you know where community building has actually helped them more than whatever certificate they walk out with or whatever learning even that they've walked out with.
Yeah, it was a backwards lesson to learn, definitely. And it's one that was actually brought home to me when I was doing my fieldwork, because I saw that when personal connections were lost with people who were leaving programs or deciding to continue on somewhere else, that when they lost that personal connection, that interest in continuing to learn dissipated, right? And so in fact, the English program I taught in lost a whole bunch of its students at one point because the teacher left, right? And I was supposed to take over his class, and I showed up the next week and nobody was there, right? Like literally no one showed up to the class because he left. And like, even though they knew me, they were all like, why are we staying with you? Like, we'd rather work with him. And since he's leaving, we'll go find something else now, right? And so that idea that people coming together and being in community was more important than, oh, I might continue to learn English, right? Like that
Yes.
I can learn English anywhere, right? I need this community building space.
Right.
And so I think that's part of it. The other thing I can say is that if we think about what educational institutions do, they give you information, right? And so they teach you things. And so I certainly hope all my students leave my classes knowing things, right? But the other thing they give you is a network and a connection. And I think this is really clear to me in Ottawa, right? As a relative newcomer to Ottawa, that my students study political science in Ottawa because of their ability to then be networked into the political scene in Ottawa, right? And so that's really important to them. And that the content of what they learn matters, but so does that network, right? And I think it also, like, I attended a couple of elite institutions in my time, and nobody goes to Yale for the education. I mean, we do go to Yale for the education, right? But we go to Yale to know people who went to Yale, right? Like, that's part of its function. And I think if you focus on those social functions of education, it doesn't do anything to diminish the importance of what you teach and how you teach it. But what it does do is make you very realistic about it. And so I think all of us need to be really realistic about the fact that we're building people not just as fact-knowing machines, but we're building people who are participants in life. And we need to make sure that people have those skills and get that set of frameworks that help them set them up for their futures.
Right. We have another 5 minutes for questions and answers, and I see a question come up already that I'll pose to you, Emily, and just wanted to say that an image came up very briefly. That's of Bayan Al-Khatib, who will be closing the webinar and who will be describing a little bit about future webinars and how we can all stay in touch, all those who are listening today and all those who are listening to this webinar in the future. So back to you, Emily. My question, or a question that's come up from the audience here, is where do you see education technology in all of this? And of course, I imagine you know that I'm not just talking about the clickers that people press buttons on in the middle of a lecture, but the technology that allows you, for example, to be teaching in Lebanon from Canada.
Yeah, I think educational technology has a huge ability to expand access to education. And this is why everybody has embraced it. Some people have embraced it because it's cheap. Some people have embraced it because it allows you to spread wider. Like, those are the two major things about it. But I'm actually quite hopeful about educational technologies because of the way I think it helps you build connections. So in my classrooms, I use a modified clicker technology, but I use it to encourage interactivity, right? Particularly in large lecture classes, right? So I've started thinking about this in my face-to-face teaching content. But I think what's important is that online technologies can allow you to get this really immersive, complete notion of who your students are, and for students to really communicate to each other in ways that are crosstalk of the professor, right? So students have much more direct access to each other in online educational environments. And so I think that really matters for them being able to build these social connections. And so I think that that's a really important thing. The problem is that a lot of educational technology frameworks assume a lecture-based delivery model of education, which we know works for some students and not for others. And we know works for some learning competencies and not for others. And so what's really important is that as we build more educational technology, that we continue to make sure that this community building, personal connection, kind of open space is essential to it, which is very challenging because, again, a lot of the reasons some people really, really, really like online technology is because it makes education cheaper. So
maybe you can tell us a bit about your experience partnering with the American University of Beirut.
Yeah, so I co-taught a course, or the terminology is twinned, right? Because we didn't have any exchanged assignments or anything like that. But I taught a class in conjunction with a colleague at the American University of Beirut in their Faculty of Health Sciences. And what I found is that we had to do two sets of work. One was she and I had to sync up what we were learning, which, since they were different courses, that required a little bit of negotiation. And the other thing was we had to try to figure out ways for the students to talk to each other. Because we said, you know, obviously I think it benefited my students to have heard, her name is Sausan Abdurrahim is my partner. I think it benefited my students to hear her lectures. I hope she thinks it benefited her students to hear my lectures. So that was one set of exchanges. But then the other thing is, you know, while our student population in Ottawa is very international and the AUB student population has a lot of mobility, we wanted to make sure we had a space where the students could talk to each other, could get to know each other. And so we ended up using Facebook for that. It worked it worked enough, right? And I think it kind of met those basic needs. But what it brought home for me is what the students appreciated about it was that opportunity to connect with other people, to hear other voices. I think our classroom conversations were richer for it. And I think anything we can do to kind of give our students the opportunity to connect bigger in the classroom is really important.
What I am hearing from you is the massive need for more innovative online technology that will capture innovative learning and community building. Is that we need less of the YouTube lectures and far more of the community building that can be done, but requires a lot of innovation in the technology. I have a long question here that I'd like to read out. It's, as an educator in schools, I see, so this is not me speaking, this is a member from the audience. As an educator in schools, I see children of immigrant communities, especially those who have experienced trauma, struggle when they first enter the system. Can you comment on the difference between adult and child education and what the priorities would be for children?
I think this is an incredibly important issue. And I think it's one that's very pressing for a lot of people right now in K through 12 education. And what I will say is that I'm less of an expert on youth education than I am in adult education. But what I will say is that the priorities for the priorities for kids really need to be a mix of things, right? Because children need to feel secure, they need to feel safe, and they also are at a developmentally crucial area where lost time in terms of educational competency is quite difficult. And our school systems all over the world are increasingly results oriented in terms of being able to put out a concrete skill package at a certain point in time, and that if you can't put that skill package forward, it's very challenging. And it creates all sorts of barriers to future development. And I've seen that in the US, I've seen it in Canada, I've seen it in Lebanon, right? It really, all of our educational systems are built like this. And so I think the priority for children would need to be making sure that that sense of settledness and that sense of you are secure in this place and you are secure as who you are in this place, right, comes and is the center of their educational experience. And that the ways they can be the ways they can learn the skill-based material continues to matter and to build on that sense of safety, because kids can't learn if they can't learn these skill-based materials if everything they're doing is caught up in dealing with the newness and the stress and the trauma happening consistently throughout their educational process. So I think it's really important to emphasize that safety and security so that the skills can build on it, even when it means adapting the program.
There are remaining questions. I may have to leave that to some other form of communication because we'll be closing in 5 minutes. I wanted to let everyone know that the PDF of Professor Emily Reagan-Wills' presentation will be available on the Al-Qazzaz Foundation for Education and Development website. So that will be available to anyone who may wish to follow up. And of course, you can always reach Professor Emily Reagan-Wills at her email at the University of Ottawa. Professor Wills is a mother of 2 children, so when she speaks of children, she knows of what she speaks. So thank you very much, Professor Wills, and I'll pass it to Ms. Bayan El-Khatib, who will say a few words about the foundation.
Thank you, Nadia. Can everybody hear me well? Okay, so thank you all for tuning in to our first webinar today. And this is the first webinar of our monthly webinar series, which will continue. And we hope to bring you experts working in the fields of education and development, like Dr. Wills, who you heard from today. My name is Bayan Khatib, and I recently joined the Al-Qazzaz Foundation for Education and Development, which we call QED for short, as the communications director. And I'm very excited about the work that we're doing. So I want to tell you a little bit about QED's vision and the direction we hope to take the organization. As the name suggests, the organization was founded by the Al-Qazzaz family and quickly grew to include among its founders and advisors a group of prominent and well-respected members of our community, including Dr. Nadia Abu Zahra, who moderated our webinar today. The Al-Qazzaz family formed QED after experiencing a prolonged and difficult ordeal where they suffered from grave human rights violations. You may have heard about their difficult journey in the news. The campaign to bring Khalid home was very well covered in the media, thanks to his wife Sarah's incredible efforts. And thousands of people from around the world supported the family throughout this time. And when Khalid and Sarah were finally able to return home to Canada, they wanted to continue their tradition of activism. And this is how QED was formed. Khalid and Sarah's passion for human rights and inclusiveness and social justice, combined with their professional experience in education and development, led to the birth of QED. The vision of QED is to build communities that embrace the values of human rights, inclusiveness, and social justice, communities that nurture and empower connected global citizens. And this is going to be done through education and development projects based in innovation and technology, because we believe that the use of innovative technology maximizes the positive social impact of education and development projects. So I want you to please keep an eye out for our upcoming monthly webinars, which you can find out about by signing up for our monthly newsletter, and also following us on Facebook and on Twitter. And I'm going to put all of those links on our Facebook page very shortly. And very importantly, I want to tell you about a very important event coming up on February 8th, which is our launch event and dinner. It's going to be at the Mississauga Convention Center. And in this event, we're going to talk about QED's first couple of programs that are upcoming. So I will post the invitation to this event on Facebook in a few minutes as well. Please check it out. And don't forget to sign up to our newsletter. We're going to have a professor from Harvard University come and talk about mental health in refugee communities and how important it is that we start thinking about this topic and finding solutions to the enormous crisis that we see before us. So please do join us on February 8th for the event. And if you have any questions, you can always ask us on the Facebook page. Thank you. Bye-bye.